Dorian Fitch did not go looking for a reason to stay. He had given that up quietly, the way men give up the things that cost them the most, without announcement, without ceremony, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday when the house had been silent, long enough that silence stopped feeling temporary. He was 54 years old and lived alone in a two-bedroom house on the western edge of Collingwood, Ontario, where Georgian Bay pushed gray water against the rocks in November, and the Blue Mountains stood behind the town like a patient argument against despair. The house was clean because he had no other project. The truck was maintained because maintenance was the one discipline that still made sense. The spare bedroom was empty because he could not fill it with anything that did not remind him of Colt. Colt had been a Belgian Malinois. Black and tan, 72 pounds, with a jaw that could disassemble a doorframe and eyes that saw things before Dorian's own instruments did. They had served together for 4 years through 2 rotations in Afghanistan, and Colt had died on a morning in Kandahar province when a buried IED shifted beneath a road the team had already crossed once. Colt had been ahead of Dorian. The dog had found the secondary device, not with his nose, but with his body. One bound forward, a sound like the end of a sentence, and then Colt was not there anymore, and Dorian was alive, and the team was alive, and those two facts would sit across from each other at the table in his chest for every meal he ate from that day forward. He came home. His wife, Alice, tried. She was a quiet, steady woman who laughed in the mornings and cooked things with rosemary, and she had loved Dorian Fitch for 11 years through deployments and injuries and all the ordinary distances those years accumulated. But loving a man who had shut the doors inside himself was a different kind of work, and Alice was human, not architecture. She left 3 years after Dorian returned, not in anger, in a kind of exhausted tenderness that was somehow worse. She hugged him in the driveway and said, "I need you to find your way back. I just can't be the only road anymore." He had not found his way back. He had stopped looking. Then Georgia Trent sent the photograph. Georgia was 43, a veterinary technician who spent her weekends volunteering for Huronia Animal Rescue out of Barrie. She was stocky and direct, with copper-red hair cut short beneath a toque, and the blunt, efficient kindness of someone who had learned that gentleness without action was just sentiment. She had Dorian's number because his neighbor, Ida Burrell, had given it to her 3 months earlier, telling Georgia that the man next door had once trained with military working dogs and might be able to help with difficult cases. Message arrived at 11:40 on a Thursday night in November. Dog found on the 400 near Innisfil, fell or was thrown. Belgian Malinois cross, about 18 months. Terrified, won't let anyone near. Highway's icing over. He'll be hit by morning if nobody moves him tonight. I know it's late. I know it's cold. Photo below. Dorian looked at the photograph for a long time. The dog had pressed itself against the concrete barrier at the edge of the breakdown lane, rain flattening its coat to its ribs. One ear was split at the tip. There was a dark mark behind the left jaw that could have been shadow or could have been blood, but it was the eyes that held Dorian still. Amber, wide, fixed on the camera with the particular look of an animal that had learned that people arrived in your life just before things got worse. He had seen that look before. On a morning in Kandahar, when Colt had glanced back once before the road moved. Dorian set the phone down. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, coat not yet on, keys not yet found. He told himself this was not his problem. He told himself he was not the kind of man who drove into an ice storm at midnight for a dog that would probably bite him. Then he picked up his keys. The drive south on the 400 was slow and mean. The highway was a black mirror under the headlights, and the rain had turned the kind of cold that was deciding whether to become something worse. Dorian kept both hands on the wheel and the radio off. Georgia was parked at the breakdown lane with her hazards going when he arrived, a tall woman in a yellow vest, standing with the patience of someone who had been standing in bad weather for a purpose all her life. The dog was 30 feet ahead of her, pressed against the barrier, shoulders hunched. "He won't come to me," Georgia said when Dorian pulled up. "Won't come to anyone. Try to slip lead twice, he just screams." Dorian looked at the dog. The dog looked back. "I'll sit with him," Dorian said. Georgia opened her mouth and closed it again. It's -7 with the wind chill. I know. He walked past her, past the edge of the hazard lights, into the dark stretch where the dog crouched. He did not approach directly. He moved to the side of the barrier, about 15 feet out, and sat down in the wet gravel with his back against the concrete. The cold came up through his jacket immediately. He rested his arms on his knees and looked at the highway, not at the dog. He waited. The dog growled, low and continuous, like an engine that could not find neutral. Dorian breathed. Traffic passed in the far lane, each set of headlights sweeping over them both. The rain turned to sleet. Dorian did not move. After 20 minutes, the growling stopped. After 40, he heard the sound of paws on wet gravel. He did not look. He kept his eyes on the highway and held his left hand slightly out, palm up at his side. The dog's nose touched the back of his hand, warm, careful, afraid. "There you are," Dorian said quietly. Not quite to the dog, not quite to himself, to something that had been waiting in him to say that for a long time. He named the dog Ash, not for sentiment, because everything worth keeping had already burned, and this was what remained. Dr. Renee Whitby ran the Collingwood Animal Clinic in a converted house on Hurontario Street with geraniums in the window boxes that she somehow kept alive past October. She was 46, lean and deliberate, with close-cropped dark hair and the manner of a person who spoke carefully because she had learned that imprecise words could do harm. She had been treating animals for 20 years and had developed the gift, if it could be called that, of being able to look at a creature and read the whole story of what humans had done to it. She read Ash in under a minute. Old ligature marks around the neck, a healed fracture in the third rib set wrong and reknit crooked. The cut behind the ear was older than the highway, weeks old, possibly a month. Underweight by 6 kilograms. Teeth worn unevenly in the way that happened when a dog had been kept somewhere it needed to chew through. How long was he living like this? Dorian said, and it came out less like a question than a statement addressed to the room. Renee looked at him steadily. Long enough. The body doesn't lie about duration. Ash lay on the exam table with his chin between his paws, watching both of them with the sideways vigilance of an animal that had learned to track exits. When Renee touched his flank, he flinched and then held himself still with visible effort, as if he had learned that flinching made things worse. Dorian recognized the strategy. He had used it himself. "He'll recover physically," Renee said. "The rest takes longer. He needs quiet, routine, no sudden movements, no raised voices, no forced contact." She paused. "Let him choose when he's ready. Trust has to be rebuilt from the inside out. You can't install it from the outside." She sent them home with antibiotics, a dietary plan, and a look that said she understood. She was giving the instructions to both of them. The first week was a lesson in patience that Dorian had not enrolled in willingly. Ash ate in short, suspicious bursts, stopping often to verify that nothing in the kitchen had moved. He slept on a blanket near the back door, close to an exit, and startled at the furnace clicking on. At night, Dorian heard him pace. 2 in the morning. 3. The sound of paws on hardwood that had not heard that sound in years. Dorian did not sleep much either. He never had, not since Kandahar. But now, instead of lying in the dark cataloging his failures, he lay listening to Ash move through the house. There was something in it, not comfort exactly, but the knowledge that he was not the only one awake in a dark place, trying to decide if the world was safe. He kept notes in the back of an old field notebook, the one he had once carried overseas. Before its pages had held coordinates, radio frequencies, and the cold arithmetic of survival. Now they filled with quieter reports. Day 2 ate the full portion, watched me the whole time. Day 4 moved the blanket away from the door to the middle of the floor. Day 5 did not flinch when the furnace came on. Day 6 sat beside the couch instead of across the room. He did not examine why he had started writing again. Some things were better done before they could be talked out of. On the 7th morning, his neighbor knocked. Ida Burrell was 71, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the house next door for 36 years and had opinions about everything from soil acidity to municipal politics, delivered in the particular cadence of someone raised in Cape Breton who had since lived everywhere else and kept the best of each place. She was small and broad-shouldered, with white hair cut bluntly at the chin and dark eyes that noticed everything. She arrived with a foil-wrapped plate of butter tarts and the expression of a woman who had been meaning to knock on this door for longer than she was going to admit. "I saw the truck in the driveway at 2 in the morning last Thursday," she said, "and then Georgia called to say you'd collected a damaged dog off the highway. I put it together." Dorian accepted the butter tarts. "You didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to, I wanted to." She looked past him into the hall. Ash was visible at the end of the hallway, standing very still. "He's a Malinois cross, is he?" "Mostly." Ida was quiet for a moment, like Colt. She had never said Colt's name before. In 3 years of living next door, through Alice leaving and through everything before and after, Ida had never pushed past what Dorian offered. He did not know why she said it now, and he did not know why it landed the way it did. Not like a wound reopened, but like a window, briefly. "Yeah," he said, like Colt. Ida nodded once. "The butter tarts are plain, not raisin, because I remember you said raisins in pastry are a betrayal of the form." She turned to leave, then stopped. "He can come to the fence if he wants. I've got a yard. I won't reach over." She went home. Ash appeared at Dorian's knee, sniffed the foil on the plate, and looked up with the focused interest of a creature who had opinions about baked goods. "Don't even think about it," Dorian said. Ash sat. It was the first time he had voluntarily sat beside Dorian without anything in it for him. And it was so small a thing that Dorian would not have been able to explain why it mattered as much as it did. The children arrived 10 days later. Zach and Hazel Lemieux lived in the green house across the street with their father, Philippe, who drove a school bus and waved from the driveway with the comfortable ease of a man who had no particular reason to be guarded. Zach was 11, all elbows and certainty, with the restless intelligence of a boy who found sitting still to be a personal insult. Hazel was 8 and precise, the kind of child who listened to adults the way a researcher listened to a subject, carefully, with the intention of drawing conclusions. They arrived on a Saturday morning with Zach's notebook open. "Mrs. Burrell said you got a dog," Hazel said. "She said he had a hard time." "He did." "Does he bite?" "He hasn't. He might." Hazel nodded as if this were a reasonable policy. Zach was already peering past Dorian into the hallway. "Is that him? He looks like a wolf." Ash had appeared at the edge of the doorway, ears up, watching the children with the focused wariness of an animal, assessing whether a situation was novel or dangerous. "Give him space," Dorian said. "Don't reach for him. If he comes to you, let him come." Hazel immediately sat on the porch step, cross-legged, hands in her lap. Zach lasted approximately 4 seconds before fidgeting, then, visibly restraining himself, went still beside her. Ash watched for a full minute. Then he crossed the doorway and stood on the porch, close enough for Hazel to see the scar behind his ear. She held perfectly still. Then Ash made a sound. Not quite a bark, not quite a whine, somewhere between the two. A low, varied sound that rose and fell like a question being worked out. Hazel's eyes went wide. He said something. "He vocalized," Dorian said. "What did he say?" Dorian kept his face neutral, hard to tell. Hazel looked at Ash with the gravity of an 8-year-old making an official ruling. "He said hello," she said. "I'm sure of it." The story was 2 streets wide by evening. By Tuesday it had acquired details Dorian had not witnessed. Ash had apparently addressed Ida by name, offered predictions about the forecast, and held a firm opinion about recycling bins left out past collection day. Bert Hayward, who lived 4 houses down and had spent 28 years as a firefighter before a roof collapse redistributed his left knee, stopped by ostensibly to ask about the eaves trough. He crouched at a respectful distance from Ash and said, with the gravity of a man used to assessing structural damage, "Smart eyes, knows more than he's letting on." "Most do," Dorian said. Bert stood carefully, the knee giving a quiet complaint. "You still take it black?" Dorian blinked. "Coffee." "I've got a pot on. You look like you haven't sat at another person's table in a while." Dorian opened his mouth to decline, then found he couldn't locate a reason that felt true. "Sure," he said. "Yeah." They sat in Bert's kitchen for an hour, and Ash lay under Dorian's chair, which surprised both of them. Bert did not ask about the service, or Colt, or Alice. He talked about hockey, the quality of the municipal snowplowing, and the structural problems with post-war bungalows, and Dorian said more in that hour than he had said to another person in a month. Walking home in the cold, he wrote in the field notebook Day 17. Sat at someone else's table, did not want to leave. Then he paused and added, Ash stayed close the whole time, like he was keeping watch. The storm came 3 weeks later, rolling in off Georgian Bay with the particular violence that the lake saved for November, a low, prolonged percussion that shook the window glass and turned the backyard into white noise. Dorian had been in the kitchen heating soup when the first crack hit. His body responded before his mind did. Shoulders dropped, hands flattened against the counter, jaw locked. The thinking part of him knew it was Collingwood. The part that mattered less was somewhere beneath the Blue Ridge Mountains of Kandahar Province in 2019. And it was not entirely wrong. Ash hit the floor at the same time, front paws stretched, belly low, ears flat. They both stayed there for a moment, the man and the dog, on opposite sides of the kitchen, both very still in the manner of creatures who had learned to be small in the presence of large sound. The second thunderclap came. Ash made his sound, the low, varied one, the one Hazel called talking, and it was directed at Dorian. Dorian exhaled. Yeah, he said, I know, I hear it. He slid down the cabinet until he was sitting on the kitchen floor, back against the cupboard. His hands were shaking slightly, which he had trained himself not to acknowledge, but in an empty kitchen, with only a frightened dog for company, the old discipline seemed beside the point. Ash crossed the floor on his belly, inch by inch, until his chin rested on Dorian's knee. They sat there through the storm. Ash didn't stop shaking. Dorian didn't pretend he wasn't. Outside, the bay answered the thunder with its own percussion, and the house creaked in the old familiar way of structures that had survived many winters and intended to survive more. By the time the rain settled into something quiet and persistent, Ash had pushed himself against Dorian's side, and Dorian had one hand resting on the dog's shoulder without having planned it. Same team, Dorian said, you and me. Ash lifted his head and looked at him with those amber-layered eyes and made the sound again. Just once, just to answer. Dorian did not sleep that night until close to 4 in the morning, but when he did, Ash was on the floor beside the bed, and when the dream came, the road, the sound, the space where Colt had been, he woke to a weight on his chest and that sound, close and deliberate, pulling him back from wherever he'd gone. Day 29 he knew before I did. The crisis came on a Sunday afternoon in early December when the first real snowstorm of the season arrived the way Ontario winters arrived. Without much warning and with considerable commitment. Hazel Lemieux had been playing in her backyard when she saw what she thought was a cat crossing the laneway at the end of the block. She followed it. She was 8, and certain, and the snow had reduced visibility to about 30 feet in any direction. Philippe came to Dorian's door at 3:15, his face controlled in the way of a parent performing the act of not panicking. I can't find Hazel. She was in the yard 20 minutes ago, I've checked the street. Dorian had the leash in his hand before Philippe finished the sentence. He was not certain Ash could track in a snowstorm. Ash had not been trained for it, not formally, not to Dorian's knowledge. What he knew was what Ash had shown him across 32 days. A nose that lifted at information too subtle for human perception, a body that moved with purpose when purpose existed. He let Ash smell Hazel's boot from the back porch, said nothing else, and followed where the dog went. Ash moved south along the laneway, head low, pace steady. The snow was horizontal and the kind of cold that was unconcerned with anyone's feelings about it. Dorian kept pace, one hand on the lead, and trusted what he was following in the way he had once trusted Colt, not because certainty existed, but because the alternative was standing still. They found her 400 meters from her house, crouched at the edge of a frozen drainage creek where the bank dropped sharply into the ice. She had chased the cat, which had, she explained with indignation, simply vanished, and then realized she did not know where she was. She had been sitting very still, arms around her knees, waiting to be found. Ash reached her first. He sat in front of her without crowding and made his sound. Hazel's face crumpled with relief. I knew you'd find me, she said, to the dog and not to Dorian. I knew you'd say something." Dorian crouched and checked her. Cold, a little scared, entirely unharmed. He wrapped his jacket around her shoulders and picked her up, and Ash walked ahead of them the whole way back, stopping every 20 feet to glance over his shoulder and verify they were still there. Philippe met them at the laneway. He said nothing for a moment, one hand on his daughter's back, eyes bright in the way of parents who had been returned something irreplaceable. Then he looked at Ash and said, "Thank you," which was not something people typically said to dogs, and which Ash received with the seriousness it deserved. Word moved through the neighborhood the way words did in small towns, quickly, warmly, with minor embellishments. By evening, Bert had arrived with a thermos of coffee. Ida came with butter tarts and the news that she had called Georgia Trent to tell her what Ash had done, and Georgia had apparently needed a moment which Georgia was going to deny. Hazel sent a note in her large, careful handwriting that said, "Thank you, Ash, for talking me home." Dorian taped it to the fridge. That night he took the spare dog tag from the drawer, the one he had kept from Colt's gear, blank, never engraved, and drove to the hardware store on Pine Street that did custom work. He had it done simply. Aish, Collingwood. Back home he sat on the floor with Ash facing him, the way Ash had taught him, no standing over, no commanding from height, eye level, choice. He held out the tag. Ash sniffed it, looked at Dorian, looked at the tag again. Then Dorian clipped it to the plain nylon collar that Renee had sent home from the clinic weeks ago, the one that had been waiting on the kitchen counter because Dorian had not felt it was earned yet, and because some things needed to be true before they were official. The metal tag caught the lamplight with a small, clean sound. "There," Dorian said, "that's yours." Ash pressed his forehead against Dorian's chest, the weight of him deliberate, the gesture unhurried, and stayed there. In that quiet kitchen, under a circle of lamplight, neither of them was healed exactly, but both of them were present, which turned out to be the more important thing. Spring came to Collingwood in stages the way it always did, mud before green, gray before blue, the bay shrugging off its ice one long crack at a time. By April, Ash had grown into his collar. His ribs were invisible beneath a coat that had thickened over winter into something glossy and even, and he moved through the neighborhood with the proprietary ease of a creature who knew every gate and every porch and every human who left things out for him. His ear no longer flattened at truck engines. His tail moved more often than not. Dorian had changed in quieter ways. He had coffee with Bert on Thursdays. He had learned, under Ida's patient instruction, to make butter tarts. Badly at first, then less badly, then well enough for Ida to say he could bring them to other people without embarrassing her. He had fixed the dragging gate at the Lemieux house because Philippe had mentioned it in passing, and because Dorian had found that small repairs were a kind of language he had forgotten he could speak. He had turned a photograph face-up on the shelf in the spare room. Colt in harness, ears forward, the particular alertness of a working dog on a good day. He had not been able to look at it for 3 years. Now he looked at it in the morning sometimes, the way you looked at a friend who'd had to leave before the story ended. He no longer turned away from the shelf. He had stopped needing to. One evening in late April, when the ice was fully out on the bay and the light held past 7, Dorian drove to the shore with Ash and sat on the rocks and called Alice. She answered on the 3rd ring, surprised but not unwelcoming. He had not called in 14 months. "I'm not calling to ask for anything," he said. "I just wanted you to know that I found my way back. It took a dog, and a retired school teacher, and an 8-year-old girl, and a man with a bad knee who makes decent coffee." He paused. "I know that's a strange list, but I thought you should know." Alice was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad, Dorian, I really am glad." He thanked her and said goodbye, and it was the right kind of goodbye. Not a closing, but a clearing. The way a space feels after something heavy has finally been moved from it. Ash had gone to the water's edge. He stood there, paws at the line where the rock met the lake, and barked twice at Georgian Bay with the composed authority of a dog who had decided the world was his to address. Then he turned back to look at Dorian with those amber, entirely calm, entirely serious eyes. Dorian called him back. Ash came immediately, Not from obedience, but from choice, which had always been the better reason. They walked back to the truck together in the last of the light. Ash jumped in, turned twice, and settled. Dorian sat behind the wheel and did not start the engine for a moment. He had driven out to that highway 11 weeks ago because he could not go. He had sat in freezing gravel for 40 minutes because he recognized a look he had seen on a road in Kandahar. He had brought home a frightened dog and called it Ash because everything worth keeping had already burned. What he had not understood then, and understood now, was that ash was not what remained after fire. Ash was what the fire left so something else could grow. He started the truck. On the seat beside him, Ash stretched once and closed his eyes, his tag catching the last light off the bay. A small, clean flash, like a compass pointing somewhere worth going. Dorian put the truck in drive and took them home.